So as promised, we're going to do a little video walkthrough of images from children's literature in North Korea, along with Christopher Richardson. He's the one that's been collecting all of these images and studying their importance to North Korea's society. Now, if you have not heard the audio version of the interview I did for the nknews.org podcast with Christopher Richardson, you may want to go and listen to that now. That provides sort of the underpinning for all of these different stories that are repeating different themes in North Korean children's culture. But if you have heard that, then we're ready to start. Let's go ahead and jump right in. We're looking first off at a still from the first story we talked about in the podcast. This is from The Butterfly and the Cock. Christopher, what are we seeing here?
What we have here, of course, is the vicious, swaggering imperialist cock lording it over the virtuous garden that stands in as symbol of the North Korean community. And on the left of the image, we have the virtuous young butterfly standing up to the rooster. And what's fascinating to me is that the rooster is more animal than man, but the butterfly is more man than animal. Mm-hmm. So although it's a sort of a tale of anthropomorphized animals that one would see in any children's literary tradition anywhere in the world, you're really left with no mistaking the fact that the butterfly is meant to represent Korean, because we have the butterfly dressed in the sort of simple traditional attire of the Korean peasant. We have, as far as I can tell, a kimchi jar in his hands.
And that scarf on his head, it almost evokes kind of a trade union or a farmers union kind of look.
Absolutely. Yeah, you see those pictures of people during the Japanese occupation period with the banners on their heads. Mm-hmm. And then the rooster, of course, it sort of has this swaggering, protruding hip. Looks like a New York capitalist meets Colonel Sanders.
And so here we have what looks to be a bit of a drunk fox. Do I have that right?
This comes from a book called The Story of a Hedgehog, which is another very simple sort of Aesopian fable. The gist of the story is really not that dissimilar to the butterfly and the cock. Only in this instance, you have a swaggering, puffed up tiger standing in place of the US imperialists. And again, you have a recalcitrant group of animals around who aren't really prepared to stand up to this tiger, except for one animal, which is the hedgehog. It's a small animal with its big bristling spines. But what happens in this story is the tiger eventually becomes so traumatized by the encounter with the hedgehog, so humiliated, that he develops a pathological terror of chestnut burrs, believe it or not. And so in this particular photo image, we have the fox throwing chestnut burrs at the tiger because the hedgehog
just remind him of what a hedgehog is like, the bristles.
Exactly. So, it's not difficult to sort of read into the sort of messages here.
And then we have another image here. It looks like a very innocent little raccoon enjoying his village life. Is this the hedgehog story too?
This, to be precise, is a raccoon dog, and the raccoon dog is a favorite animal in North Korean children's literature.
Is that a real thing, or is that's just in the imagination, right?
I didn't think it could possibly be a real thing, but it is a real thing. There is a raccoon dog. And this is the youngest raccoon dog on Flowery Hill, to be precise. It features in an anthology of children's stories. This is a good moment to sort of reflect on the close relationship between North Korean children's books and North Korean children's television. And all these characters that we see in these images featuring in North Korean children's books tend to recur across the North Korean children's culture more generally. They'll show up in films, they'll show up in murals that you'll see in classrooms, even in hospitals, all over the place, in statues that you'll find in parks. These sort of anthropomorphized animals, often in fairly military poses, show up all around North Korea. And they're the kind of a very strange antidote to the more traditional militaristic mythological statuary that marks the North Korean landscape, because you have this strange contrast between these awe-inspiring statues of Kim Il-sung and now Kim Jong-il and these very odd little statues of cartoon characters that show up around. But they're meant to be reminders to children of these classic North Korean children's stories.
Interesting. Okay, this is kind of surreal.
I love this image. This is from one of the most famous North Korean children's stories of all, which is the story of the winged horse. A very resonant image in North Korean culture because, of course, it brings to mind memories of the Chilima, the halcyon era, if you like, of industrial and economic development in North Korea. And the symbol of the winged horse, or the 1,000-ri horse, is a symbol from East Asian mythology stretching into antiquity, but came to be associated with this economic and industrial movement, and people who exceeded their targets and were seen as exemplary workers were called Chilima riders. And the story of the winged horse is a very simple fable, and the story tells the tale of basically a village called Drum, which stands up and resists the samurai invader. And what's interesting is that, once again, the village is symbolic of the DPRK in general, and what we have are three brothers who set out on a journey from their village to find the mythical winged horse, which they believe will give them a supernatural sort of power to overwhelm the forces of the invader. And the first and second son fail in their attempts to master the winged horse, and it falls to the third child to mount and fly the horse against the Japanese invaders. And this image comes right from the end of the story, when the boy is flying the winged horse into battle against the Japanese invaders, who almost miraculously simply fall down gibbering in terror before the might of the young boy. And I think that this story, lives on in North Korea after many generations, because it's a good story. But I also think that it's probably found itself a new resonance in today's DPRK, because whether or not it's officially acknowledged, as we know, Kim Jong-un is the third son of his father. And so this idea that it might in fact fall to the third son to save the village is perhaps a very resonant idea in the contemporary DPRK.
Moving on now, we see more of a literal figure, like a samurai type figure.
Exactly. So these are some of the samurais from A Winged Horse. And I think what's interesting is the unapologetic racialism of the depiction of the samurai, that on the one hand you've got the North Koreans depicted as being beautiful, with almost cherubic faces. They never get dirty. They never seem to get covered in blood or sweat. They're always pristinely attired. And they're always exuding that kind of revolutionary innocence, or sopakam, as the Koreans like to say. But you have, in time and time again in North Korean children's literature, the enemy is reduced to an ugly caricature, a sort of a monstrous stereotype. And so here we have Japanese invaders with horrible phallic red noses. They're bandy-legged. They're practically ogres.
They're almost like the Nazi Jew representation.
Yeah, there is absolutely a Semitic twist, if you like, to North Korean racialism in the depiction of the enemy. I don't think that that's an accident, actually. And so the samurais are reduced effectively to sort of stalking monsters of the childhood imagination. They're not depicted as individuals. Their culture is not valued or understood or respected. They're simply beasts to be mowed down. And The Winged Horse, like so many North Korean children's books, is if nothing else, a redemptive ode to the power of ultraviolence, because invariably these stories end with a cathartic eruption of violence against the aggressor, whether it's a rooster or a samurai. There's seldom a negotiated end to these encounters, shall we say. They always end in a hail of bullets or spears, with the enemy cut down. And that's certainly the fate that awaits these samurai in A Winged Horse.
Kind of a Tarantino ending.
Oh yeah, it's always a Tarantino ending in North Korean children's literature, with the one sort of exception that tagged on at the end. There's always a nice, trite, easily repeated and digested moral for those at home who missed the point.
All right, let's jump ahead here. We've got what looks like a very sloppy banquet going on.
This is the story that seems to have captured people's imagination the most in the conversations I've been having with people in recent months. And I suppose I can understand why. Apart from anything else, it's got a magnificent title rendered into English, which is Boys Wipe Out Bandits. This is a story which, unlike A Winged Horse, is directed inwards. And at stake here is the virtue of what's presumed to be other Koreans, and what we have is, once again, a pure-hearted and virtuous collective revolving around a village in an isolated, rural, bucolic area of the Korean peninsula. Only in this case, instead of being harried and harassed by samurai or US imperialists, they're being harassed by a group of reactionaries, gluttons, and in this case bandits, lurking in the hills. And this picture, it's just fantastic, really, isn't it? You've got a banquet of thieves, and one of the characteristics of these bandits is that they're so revolting, they're so reactionary that they swindle each other as much as anyone else. They stuff their throats with wine and food, and all of them are grotesque to look at. And it's down again to the village, in this case again represented by a group of children, to stand up to defeat the bandits.
This is from the same story, is that correct?
Exactly. So this is simply an action moment from later in the book where you have Nose Windmaker, who's one of the monstrous bandits, unleashing his own supernatural powers, if you like. Each of the bandits has some kind of exaggerated physical characteristic, either a particularly outsized nose or outsized ears, whereas the children simply have their courage and their pluck. So we've got, once again, grotesque creatures being defeated by virtuous children. This is just another one of the bandits, crazy guy called Quick Ear. I just love this little image, actually.
I thought at first that's a mouse, but that's a human depiction of just a guy with big ears, right?
Yeah, it's just a revolting decadence. I guess this is emphasis on the senses, that the villains of the piece are very driven by their senses. They're all about consuming and taking advantage of their environment rather than living, I guess, at peace with it. And the large ears, the large eyes, and the large nose are all symbols of that.
Okay, so this seems like a fairly realistic depiction, regular human beings, Korean.
Yeah, this is nice. One thing that there's no question that Koreans on both sides of the demilitarized zone have in common is a love of medieval and pre-medieval Korean history. And both the film industries in both the Koreas produce endless films about ancient history in Korea, and the same is true of children's literature in both Koreas. And these stories are much more elegant, are much more, again, very romanticized, an emphasis on the past as a period preceding the taint of Japanese colonialism and the shadow of the Korean War. There's a romanticization of the past, something in common with a lot of political social systems in the world that we could think of on both ends of the ideological spectrum. This sort of fixation on a sort of a romanticized past as a place of untrammeled and pure social identity. And these are just great tales. They're very common in North Korea. Some of them are historical, others are more mythological. But again, this is one that was allegedly told by Kim Il-sung himself, the Tale of the Two Generals.
Okay, that's them on horseback there.
That's right. Yeah.
And I suppose when these images start to come up, we're getting into a slightly older readership than with the butterfly and the rooster. We're starting to tell actual historical stories. This is the cover for another one, right?
Yeah, this is a fun one that's been translated into English. This is just, and I think this is another one this is another one from Kim Jong-il. This is called Magic Crystal Gem, and it's just bonkers. It's probably one of the most nuts in the collection that I have. It's, again, not very subtle. It's a tale of bandits. It's set in a mythologized past, again, set in the past, and depicted as a fairy tale for instructive purposes. But again, very, very strong racial profiling of the enemy. These ones absolutely golem-like, but of course running aground on the virtuous Korean collective.
Interesting. Oh, wow. And now that's some profiling of an enemy. This is also from Magic Crystal Gem, right?
That's right, yes.
Very ugly kind of guy. I imagine he gets his comeuppance at the end.
Totally. Well, you can just tell that he's not a socialist. He's not a revolutionary.
So here we have our first instance that we've seen in this album of an obvious U.S. soldier. It looks like is he sweating blood there, or is that the blood of people he's killed, or what's going on?
Probably a little bit of both. This book is called Dean Captured, and it is a retelling of a very famous historical incident in the Korean War when the North Koreans seized Major General William F. Dean in 1950. A terrible blow at the time for the U.S. war effort. And it's a very, very typical sort of representation of the Korean War in North Korean children's literature that has a pungent cocktail of truth and fiction. And that's just a depiction there on the cover of Dean, of Major General Dean, gripped with existential dread, lamenting the day that he ever set foot on the Korean peninsula. And regretting the foul Machiavellian scheming that led the US to get itself involved in the civil war on the Korean peninsula. But of course, civil war wouldn't be an expression used here. It would be regret of a full-scale mass invasion from nowhere.
Right, exactly. And this is also from that. This is one of the inner pages from that, right? Exactly.
So that gives you a taste of the graphic novel style that dominates. It's a style that is in construction totally familiar to readers of comic books in elsewhere in the world. The quality of the paper is poor typically for North Korean children's books, and you can see that there through the scan. Let's see. Yes, we have the boot in the lower half of the bottom panel that literally has the letters USA inscribed on it, which is obviously a very potent symbol. But again, even though it's an historical story, it's still told as an adventure, and despite its ideological content, it's not exactly hard reading.
And this is presumably a freedom fighter in North Korea?
Yeah, that's right. This is Take That Rifle, Comrades, which is a graphic novel depicting the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle. So, as I've said, the twin pillars of military-themed graphic novels are, of course, the Korean War and the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle. Many books simply recounting the heroic exploits of North Korean freedom fighters during the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle. On the one hand, very violent, often graphic depictions of death and destruction. But then again, when I first saw South Korean cinema, I was struck by the sort of freewheeling violence that's depicted in films, for younger audiences as well. So a sort of let's say a certain frankness about violence and the effects of violence is in common between the two Koreas. But there is certainly a luxuriating in historical violence in the North that you don't get certainly in South Korea. I was asked by a colleague how much time I'd taken to discover whether these sorts of things existed in South Korea in equivalent forms, and the answer is that when I went to South Korea last year, I made a special effort to track down as many books as I could for children from South Korean bookstores dealing with any of the same historical eras that are dealt with in these North Korean children's books. And when I would ask the stall clerks for books on the Korean War, after the initial blank reaction, they would lead me to shelves full of books of medieval Korean warfare. That there simply is not a broad body of literature for children in South Korea dealing with either of these historical periods, and certainly not a body of literature dealing with the historical leaders of South Korea, of the Republic of Korea, to match the literature equivalents in North Korea. So there's a huge diversion in the children's cultures between North and South, and as has often been suggested, North Korea is a land of remembrance, whereas South Korea is a land to some extent of forgetting. But the problem is that the remembrance, as it's conducted in the North, is very carefully contrived and controlled, and perhaps not so much remembrance after all as reimagining.
Understood.
And that's what we get time and time again in these books.
And this is from the interior of that book, Take This Rifle, Comrade, right?
This is a different book, but same genre. This is from a book called Illustrated Reminiscences with the Anti-Japanese Guerrillas. We are not to stop our struggle anytime or anywhere, which is a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
This is the most recent book in my collection, and it makes a point very clearly that the more things change, the more things stay the same, particularly north of the demilitarized zone, because for this to be the most recent book in the collection it really cuts to the heart of this drive to sort of maintain and reinforce the cultural orthodoxies that have existed in North Korean children's culture now for almost 60 years. This is another. I think it's a great piece of art. Basically, I mean, you've got the heroic square-jawed Korean freedom fighters firing their pistols and taking it to the Japanese, and this was published in the Kim Jong-un era. So this is the kind of book that could have been around for decades, but still being produced now.
It's still relevant, and it's
still relevant.
The art is not really changing. It's still this sort of pen stroke kind of black and white style. Has the art evolved to your knowledge?
I think that there has been a diversification of styles in the last 20 years or so, a proliferation of titles and a variety of graphical styles imitating to a greater or lesser extent the artistic traditions of the West, Hollywood and Disney in particular, and then the manga styles in Japan. But there's certainly no room for thinking too much outside the box. It's still a case that the artists and writers have to adhere to the style laid down for them by the state.
Understood. This is interesting. Full color. Yeah,
full color on the outside. Unfortunately, not full color on the inside. Although there are children's books with color splashed about, as we've seen, truthfully, majority are still in black and white, which is a reflection of the expensive nature of printing and paper and the lack of resources still in the north.
By the way, Christopher, what would one of these books typically cost relative to what, say, North Koreans earn nowadays? They're relatively cheap. They're meant to be relatively cheap, right?
Yeah. I mean, often they're not for personal ownership. There are lending libraries at most schools. Public libraries are very popular still in North Korea. And then there are tiny sort of startup libraries that people have sort of formed on the side of the road. I've seen pictures of a wagon that might be pulled on the back of an ox laden with books. And they are little personal privatized lending libraries, which is, again, another little insight into the changing economic situation and changing economic scene in North Korea. But mostly, I think children come to these books through official collections, through libraries.
So this, we're seeing, I think, The Sherman in Flames, right?
Exactly. This book is, believe it or not, volume 88 in an ongoing series of graphic novels for North Korean juvenile readers called Illustrated Korean History. And this one is Sherman, the U.S. pirate ship. And it's one of those books that's attributed to an author. So there are some North Korean authors who are named, and you can track their careers over time. This is by Chae Hong-sik, who's a very prolific writer. And he has written this book, Sherman, the U.S. pirate ship, which, of course, traces the fateful encounter between Western power and Korea in 1866, in which the Sherman sailed up the river into Pyongyang. And it's seen as foreshadowing later confrontations. So it's a sort of a very early example of Korean pluck standing up against the might of the American empire. And so these sorts of historical tales are really central to North Korea's representation of itself, because it helps reinforce a vision, if you like, of the Yankee as eternal foe, that it's not simply something that came out of nowhere, that there's a long history of foreign forces trying to conquer the Korean peninsula. And here you have an image of the crew of the Sherman. And in this book, you have your sort of very typical rogues gallery of foreign forces. So on the one hand, you have military people, you have merchants, but also very interestingly, you have very overt representations of Christian symbols. So sort of the three forces of capitalism, Western military imperialism, and religion are very often combined to create a sort of cocktail of perfidy in depictions of Americans in Korean children's books and Korean literature more generally. So there's things that you perhaps wouldn't expect to see in children's books in other parts of the world. Very specific attacks on Christianity, for example, and depictions of grotesque, vicious sort of bishops in terrifying flowing robes, plotting the cultural demise of the Koreans. So the Sherman incident, of course, ended badly for the Sherman, and it's another celebrated incident in Korea's long history of resistance to foreign forces.
Interesting. And then an image to end on. It looks like we've got a young and handsome Kim Il-sung here, right?
A very young and handsome Kim Il-sung. I mean, this is one of the fascinating elements of North Korean representations of the leaders, is that, well, they're depicted obviously at their best, and there seems to be sort of three particular stages of life: their childhood, their prime, and then sort of senior years, where they sort of take on a more avuncular senior role, more of a paternal figure. But this is from a book called Arduous March, which is, as your listeners probably know, a reference to the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle, but also, of course, a reference to the famine years. And
right.
During the Great Famine, during the 1990s, the North Korean state attempted to seize back control of its information environment and inscribe its sort of revolutionary orthodoxies. And one way they attempted to do that was to sort of rather tragically resell the people suffering back to them as a reincarnation of Kim Il-sung's arduous march during the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle. And this book, it's interesting. It's an interesting one in the collection because it was published in 1997. So when the famine was sort of really rolling on, and yet it's one of the most colourful. So no expense was spared to produce this book by DPRK standards, and certainly by the standards of the mid to late 90s. And although there's no direct mention of the situation in contemporaneous times to the publication of the book, it's clearly meant to be a rallying cry to the young readers to remember that their suffering was shared and felt by the great leader during his own arduous march.
And yet it's a very consoling image, isn't it? I mean, it is. He's not rallying or disciplining his troops. He's going there and putting his hand on his shoulder in almost a paternal kind of way or a brotherly way.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the one of the key points that comes through in Brian Meyer's analysis of North Korean propaganda, that instead of the sort of virility cult that perhaps is more typical of authoritarian leaders, we have an almost maternal leader figure, a parental leader, both mother and father, a tender-hearted leader who comes to take away your pain in a sort of a almost Christ-like way. And in books like this, you have pictures of great suffering, but all the while you have Kim Il-sung glowing beatifically, rosy-cheeked, with his hair just so, in his uniform ever pristine, ready to sort of appear to give comfort to his people.
Is it me, or does he look a bit like Elvis in this picture?
yeah. Well, there's definitely a bit of that going on. I mean, there's no doubt that representations of Kim Il-sung are meant to be, dare I say, not so much sexualized, but certainly a romanticized depiction of the leaders, that they're meant to stand as the object of not only veneration but desire. And time again, you have songs and poems in which the leaders sort of take the place of lovers or parents that the individual is longing for, and it's their presence and their touch and their comfort which ultimately reinvigorates the spirits and gives one the courage and pluck to fight on, to see another day, no matter how rough the odds.
Absolutely fascinating. And just ratio-wise, Christopher, how often out of the canon of children's or teens literature would you see Kim Il-sung in a depiction like this? Is it 1 out of 10, 1 out of 100? Just guesstimating.
I'd say it's more than 1 out of 100, but less than 1 in 10. All
right, fair enough. So it's rare, but it's not a common thing, but it's not so rare that it's difficult to find.
These are absolutely central. I mean, ultimately, no matter how inventive North Korean children's authors are, they ultimately all come back to this central narrative, which is the narrative of the Kim family, the fatherly leader, the motherly leader that the entire imagined community of Kim Il-sung is called upon to follow. It's the master narrative. It's a narrative inscribed in text, in symbol, in ritual, in song. In a sense, it doesn't even have to be depicted all the time. All it takes is for a reference to conjure up for the listener or the reader the entire master narrative, which they're imbibing from the moment that they're born.
Christopher, this has been so interesting walking through these photos with you. Really want to say thank you once again for your time, and really appreciate all of the work you've done on this research. Thank you again.
My pleasure, Kurt. Thank you.